Hi everybody, Captain Al speaking with your training tips designed to help make you a better, more knowledgeable flight simmer, pilot, or aviation enthusiast. Have a seat, let's strap in and stow the HUD and see what is on the horizon for today. Our briefing today will cover: under flight training, we're looking at the captain and first officer scan flow procedures. Let's start with the first officer scan flow procedure. This is normally accomplished after the preliminary pre-flight procedure is complete. Remember, if you're going from a cold, dark airplane, you would do the safety check or establish AC power by the electrical power-up procedure. Once you've done that, we normally adjust our lighting, and then we would do the preliminary pre-flight procedure. If you haven't viewed those are separate modules within the training briefings. But after the preliminary pre-flight is complete, then the first officer could either walk around the airplane, do the exterior pre-flight. In some countries, the captain is the one to do the exterior pre-flight. Here in the U.S., the first officer is normally the one that walks around the airplane. And then when he comes back, he would start on his scan flow procedure. The scan flow procedure is done from memory and then backed up by a checklist. The first officer, it is interesting to note, does most of the interior pre-flight. It should be noted that airlines can modify Boeing procedures, but the Boeing procedures have the first officer doing most of the interior pre-flight. There are some airlines, not many, that have the captain doing most of the interior pre-flight. They've strayed further away from Boeing procedures than some airlines do. Some airlines stay very close to Boeing procedures, and other airlines may influence their own airline philosophy, which is born of many years of trial and error, and they may modify procedures to suit their airline culture. In our case, we're pretty much going straight by Boeing procedures. And so for our purposes, the first officer would be the one that does most of the interior pre-flight. The first officer will, in general, check the overhead panel. He checks his flight instruments and his oxygen and his instrument source select switch panel and things like that. He also checks the ICAS, both the primary and secondary ICAS indications, and pretty much the center panel, and he checks most of the aisle stand. So you can see he's got a pretty big chunk of real estate that he checks. The captain, on the other hand, has more limited duties. He checks the mode control panel, he checks his flight instruments, he checks the standby instruments or the ISFD instrument, depending on configuration that your particular airline has. And then he checks the thrust quadrant, and then he has a very limited function on the aisle stand. So he has less real estate to check in terms of what he checks. However, the captain is still responsible for everything, so don't be surprised if the captain doesn't take a look at the overhead panel to make sure the first officer has set it up correctly. The scan flow procedure will follow a logical flow progression from one area to another. We are checking all of our switches. A lot of the switches in the jet are comprised of push-button switches, which can be categorized as alternate action switches or momentary action switches. These are being checked. When we do check these, we're checking both the switch position and the system status to make sure it's correct. So you're not only checking the switch position, but you're checking the light indication as well, or the system status. We're also checking a lot of rotary switches, toggle switches, and lever positions as well. So the sequence of events thus far would be, if it's a cold, dark airplane, to do our safety check. I call it the safety check, or the electrical power-up procedure to establish AC power. Once you have AC power on the airplane, then we would adjust all lighting as necessary. Just a reminder that in our training briefings we have separate modules on the safety check and electrical power-up and preliminary pre-flight. And then there is a separate training module for the lighting, adjusting all the lighting. So typically we establish AC power, we adjust our lighting, and then we do the preliminary pre-flight procedure. Once that's completed, then one of the pilots, could be the pilot flying, could be the captain, could be the first officer, could be either crew member, will do the FMS CDU pre-flight. Depends on airline. Many airlines, it may be the pilot flying that is the one that does the CDU pre-flight. In other airlines, it may be the captain that does the CDU pre-flight while the first officer is walking around the airplane. And then at some point we do our captain and first officer scan flow procedure. And once that is completed, you reach the point where you adjust your seat and adjust your rudder pedals. And then we would accomplish the pre-flight checklist. The pre-flight checklist will check what we did from memory for the scan flow, for both the captain and the first officer scan flow. So let's hop on over to the virtual simulator and see the scan flow in action. Okay, we're in the virtual simulator now, and let's start the first officer scan flow, followed by the captain scan flow. If you're a flight simmer, you're going to do both of these things together. Since you don't have two crew members to do it, you have to do everything. So the first officer scan flow starts at the top of the overhead panel. And just as a general rule, when we're checking all the flight deck, we're checking a bunch of switches. We're checking push button switches, which are alternate action and momentary action switches. We're not only checking the switch position, but we're checking the system status, or the light indication, as well. We're checking the position of toggle switches. We're checking the position of rotary switches. We're checking the position of levers as well. So there's a lot of different things that we're checking as we go through the flight deck setup. We want to be thorough in how we check things because it's very easy to miss something. So starting at the overhead panel, we're going to check that the EEC switches, the guards, are closed, the switches are in norm or normal, and the alternate lights are extinguished. Now, if you're not sure what these lights look like, just come down to the indicator light panel and do a test, and then you can see what those lights look like since they are not illuminated. That's a good way to get familiar with what the light indications are. The IRUs are in nav. They should be from the preliminary pre-flight procedure. Standby power is in auto from the electrical power-up procedure. The battery switch is also on from the electrical power-up procedure. Utility buses, we're going to check that they're both on and the off lights are extinguished. And this is a good time to start the APU. To start the APU, we'll go to the on position. We'll hold it and start momentarily, and then release it to the on position. That'll start the APU start sequence. It'll take about a minute or so for the APU to get started. We don't have to monitor it because the APU controller does that for us. So if there's any fire or faults or start problems, the APU controller will shut it down and we'll get the appropriate ICAS message. Right now if we were a freighter, this is how we'd want the power set up with one power source. In this case we have external 1 and external 2. Right now the main deck handling bus would be powered on a freighter. We're a passenger airplane, so we don't really care that we don't have a main deck handling bus. So we go ahead and turn external 2 on, and since we are a passenger airplane. You can see the APU just started. We have avail lights. Avail lights mean frequency and voltage are good. So at this time we could switch over to APU power. We want to do that at least 20 minutes prior to pushback in case there's any transient faults on the switch over to power, which could generate some status messages, and then we could have maintenance address those if needed. From there we'll go down to the bus tie switches. They're all in auto, and the isolation lights are extinguished. The generator control switches should all be on. You'll notice here one is off, but it's very easy. If you're doing this quickly, it's very easy to miss that one of these is not in the on position. Even more so, if you had all four off, it's very easy to just blow through this and say, yeah, that looks good, and just keep going. But the switch should be on and the off light should be illuminated. So in this case, the alternate action switches are off. When the switch is off, the mechanical shutter will cover the symbol on, and you don't see anything. It's blank up here. The switch is in the out position or off position. The mechanical shutter is covering the symbol on. When we turn the switch on, the mechanical shutter will lift out of view. It'll actually go kind of up into the top of the switch, and then the on symbol will be displayed. So you can see once we turn it on, the mechanical shutter lifts up and the on symbol appears. Of course, we want all these switches on, and we want all the off lights illuminated. The off lights are monitoring the GCB, the generator control breaker, and the GCB right now is open. And with a switch on, not only is the GCB open, but the field is closed as well when we have the switch on. If we take the switch and we turn it off, that's going to open the field, and also open the the GCB would remain open. So this one switch controls two things. It controls the generator breaker and it controls the generator field. If we were to go right now up to the overhead maintenance panel, we would see that one of the field off lights is illuminated now. The number one field off light would be illuminated because the field is open at this point. If we take the switch and turn it on, then that light on the overhead maintenance panel would extinguish. The field off light would extinguish when I turn the switch on. The drive switches, the guard should be closed, the drive light should be illuminated because there is low oil pressure in the IDG. IDG stands for Integrated Drive Generator. It's a generator and a CSD in one unit. It has its own oil supply, so the drive light is looking at that oil supply. And if the oil is, when the engines are shut down, it has low oil pressure. And so that would cause the drive light to illuminate on the ground like this, and that's a normal situation. In the airplane, these are safety wired closed. So you would see a little safety wire on the bottom here that keeps these closed. And you would have to actually exert a little bit of a force in order to break the safety wire and open the guard if you were to use them in flight if you had a problem. Moving down to hydraulics, the system fault lights should all be illuminated. And the reason for that is because you have low system pressure right now. The hydraulics are not operating, so we have low system pressure. System fault light illuminates. The demand pump pressure lights should all be illuminated because all the demand pumps are off. We want to check that the demand pumps are all off. Number 1 and number 4 are air driven. Number 2 and number 3 are electric driven. That's to save weight on the airplane. The engine driven pumps all should be on, and pressure lights are illuminated because the engine pump is not producing pressure. It's not producing pressure because the engines are not running. You'll notice that from the generator control switches down, there's all lights. And you'll notice from the generator control switches up, there's no lights, other than these available lights and these on lights here. But otherwise, you'll notice in the switches, there's no lights in the auto, there's no lights in the battery, there's no lights for utility, and there's no lights for alternate. But everything from generator control down, there's lights everywhere: off, drive, system fault, pressure. So that's a good way to check this. From here down, all lights. From here up, no lights. Lighting as desired. I got the storm lights on now so we can see a little bit better. Lighting we talked about in the lighting module. You can go back and review that if you haven't, because it talks about all exterior and interior lighting. We'll come up to the center overhead now, and we're going to do a fire overheat test. This is normally done by maintenance. Many airlines have maintenance do it, and the crew does not do it. The reason for that is because when you do the test, it will sound a horn in the nose gear, and maintenance could come running thinking there's a fire. So unless they're briefed that you're going to do a test, and it's a short horn that doesn't last too long, but a lot of airlines say, well, we don't really want horns going off in the nose area, so we will make that a maintenance test. And if you do the test, it's going to bring on all your lights, your number 1, 2, 3, 4 fire lights. The APU would light up. Your forward nav cargo would light up. Your fuel control switches would light up. We'd get the fire bell. We'd have an ICAS message that says fire test in progress. And after about 8 to 10 seconds, it completes the test, and it says fire test pass or fire test fail. So let's see if I can give that to you and move down to the lower panel. And there's all our lights on the top. Go to lower panel, you see fire test in progress, and then it should change to fire test pass, which it does if the test is good. If the test is not good for some reason, it would say fire test fail. And then it would generate some status messages, and you'd have to get that addressed. Again, not normally a test. It can be, it depends on the airline, but it's not normally a test that the crew does. Emergency lights, are going to arm those by closing the guard. You'll notice there's a little clip here, a little metal clip, and when you close the guard, that pulls this clip down, which pulls the switch down into the arm position. So one thing you want to make sure is that little clip, you can't do it in the virtual simulator, but you want to make sure it's around that switch. Sometimes if it's not around that switch, it won't pull it down to the arm position. But we don't have to worry about that in the virtual simulator because we have no physical control of that. So we'll close the guard. That puts the switch in armed. Observer audio and normal, service interphone off. Main transfer 1 and 4 switch should be off, and a blank indication. There's no light in here. You'll notice if I do a light test, some switches don't have lights. This is simply a switch that will go on or off. This allows fuel to transfer from 1 into 2 and 4 into 3. That does happen automatically during fuel jettison. That's how we get fuel out of tanks 1 and 4. During fuel jettison, gravity feeds into 2 and 3, and then out the dump manifold. There's not too many procedures that actually call for the crew using this. In fact, I don't know of any. This is used for balance if we need it, but it's really for crew use. It's a switch that stays idle pretty much. Fire switches in. If we were in the flight deck, we'd actually take our hand and put it up there and push these in to make sure they're in. 1, 2, 3, 4, including the APU. Discrete lights should all be extinguished. Cockpit area microphone. We just check the condition of this, make sure the screen is clear and it's not broken or anything. Forward and aft cargo arm switches should be off and no light indications. Discharge switch should be blank, guard closed. Start switches, again, physically I'd push these in to make sure they're in. Push, 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 push. Standby ignition selector in normal, continuous ignition selector switch off. Auto selector in single, and the auto start switch is on. The fuel jettison panel, we want to make sure the selector is off, and the nozzle valve switches are blank and the guards are closed. Fuel panel, we want to make sure main tanks 1, 2, 3, and 4 switches are all off and not on. On would look like this. Off looks like that. We'd want to make sure the overrides 2 and 3 are off, the center tank pumps are off, and the stabilizer tank pumps are off. You'll notice that there are pressure lights in main tanks 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. The pressure lights in the overrides and the pressure lights in the stab and the pressure lights in the center tank are inhibited, mainly to maintain quiet, dark cockpit, but on the ground they will be inhibited. And in the air, it's normal to turn these stab pumps off when there's no fuel in the stab. When we get to the point where there's no fuel in the center, we turn these pumps off. When we go tank to engine, we turn these pumps off. So in order to not have pressure lights staring us in the face for the next 6, 7, 8 hours, these lights are inhibited. So that's why you don't see pressure lights in these pumps right now. APU is running. So number 2 aft pump and number 3 aft pump are being used by the APU at this point to run the APU, since we have AC power. We're also going to check that all cross feeds are open. 2 and 3 should be open automatically because they're system logic. They have guards, and these normally stay open. We usually don't mess with these unless the procedure calls for it. But we do have to open 1 and 4. This was configured probably for tank to engine, so now we want to make sure they're open for the cockpit setup. So all cross feeds should be open. Moving down to anti-ice, depending on what configuration you have, you might have these push button switches for the engine anti-ice, or you might have toggle switches like you see here. The toggle switches will have the auto position. These switches, if you had the push button switches, it would just be on and off. There's no auto. The auto switches allow the anti-ice to operate automatically, except for the nacelle anti-ice, they do not work automatically on the ground, so you'd have to turn it on if we had icing conditions on the ground after engine start. And of course the wing anti-ice, same thing. It's got an auto position. It'll work automatically. It doesn't work on the ground, but once you're in the air and the leading edge flaps are retracted, then the wing anti-ice will operate, and it would operate automatically. Or you can turn it off, or you can turn it on. But we check all these switches right now are in the auto position, which they are. Coming over to your ice and rain panel, we'll check the window heat. We'll turn that on if it's not on. My procedures call for turning this off as part of the securing checklist. Some airlines do not do that. Boeing procedures don't do that either, but my procedure calls for that, so that's why they were off. Rain repellent, these have been replaced a long time ago, and normally you won't even see in op here. These have been removed completely. The buttons have been, this would just be a blank area now. So we just pretty much ignore that. Wiper should be off. Again, this is part of my safety check. Electrical power up and make sure these are off. Some airlines, Boeing doesn't have that. Some airlines don't have that, but it's not a bad thing to have on the safety check, because if they happen to be on and you establish power, they could scratch a dry windshield. So we just check again that they're off. Washer fluid, these are spring loaded to the off position. The washer fluid is located behind the captain's seat. It's in a little roller door that houses emergency equipment, and that's where we can check the level of the washing fluid, is right in the flight deck itself. Moving down to lighting, as desired with the aisle stand panel flood. Again, this is addressed in lighting. Remember, we want to adjust our lighting after we establish AC power. Before we do the preliminary pre-flight procedure. That's so you can see everything as you're checking things. You don't want to be checking things in a darkened environment. Landing lights should be off. Off. Runway turn-offs off. Taxi lights off. Moving up here, passenger oxygen should be guarded closed. You lift the guard, the switch will be in the normal position. That's where it should be. That allows the passenger oxygen mask to drop automatically at 14,000 foot cabin. If the cabin reaches 14, the masks are going to drop automatically. They can be reset at 12,000 feet, or you can drop them yourself. The only difference is if you drop them yourself, you're getting there's 3 flow control units for this passenger oxygen, and you'll get all 3 if they drop automatically, whereas if you drop them as a precaution, you only get 2 of the flow control units. It's still adequate oxygen, it's just a higher flow if they drop automatically by cabin above 14. The yaw dampers should be on. The in-op lights may or may not be illuminated. It really depends on if the IRUs are aligned or they're not aligned. When the first IRS enters the nav mode, the in-op lights would extinguish. That doesn't mean the yaw dampers are operating, but that's when the in-op lights extinguish. It would take hydraulic power, and it would take aerologic in order for the yaw damper system to work. Moving down to pressurization, we really do nothing here. We can come down here and check to make sure that the landing altitude, well, we have nothing in there right now. So, but we could come down and check that that's in the auto position. Let's see if I go back up here, and if I do push that on, let's just show you that. If I push it on and come back down, it's probably going to say manual now. No, it's not. Probably because we have nothing in the CDU here for let's go back to FMC here. See what we got. Actually, let me leave this on the menu page because we do want to talk about that. We'll come back to this. It's just not up yet because we have nothing in the CDU. But there's nothing really to check here anyway. You don't want to push that because that would make it go to manual versus auto. Outflow valve should be open. The manual switches should be off, so that it's automatic control of the outflow valves. If they're on, they would look like this. There's no light indication here. Notice if I do a light test, there's nothing here. There's nothing on the bottom of this switch for a system status light. We just want to make sure they're off. The switch is spring-loaded to the middle position, and then you can go open or closed, and you have to hold it open or closed if these outflow valve switches are on to manually control the outflow valves, but normally they're automatically controlled. In auto, we check that it's normal, and then it would select A or B on an alternating flight basis. Passenger temperature selector, about the mid position or as desired. Flight deck, same thing. You can always adjust this as necessary. Zone reset switch should be blank, no lights. Trimmer switch should be on. There is no light down here. Many times what they've added, I don't know if you can you see? Yeah, I guess you can see it here. See this little line right here? It's a little white line. It's actually more pronounced on the flight deck, but it just is telling you don't look for a system light down here because there is none. So it has a little white horizontal line that's drawn across here. It's kind of the PMDG model. It's kind of dim here, but in the airplane it's actually more pronounced. And it's just telling you there's no, again, if we do a light test, you'll see there's no light there. So they have these little white lines here and here denoting that there's no, don't be looking for a system status light. Trimmer on, upper recirc, lower recirc fans on, aft cargo heat off. Equipment cooling should be normal. High flow off. Gasper on in the passenger airplane. And then we come down to our packs, so we can turn them on at this time. Since we got the EPU running, we need some air. We could have turned them on earlier too if it's hot in the airplane and we need to get some air going. Pack reset switch, we're going to check to make sure the system fault light is extinguished there. This is a momentary action switch. There are some switches that are momentary action. Most of them are alternate action, but for example, this is momentary action. The zone reset switch is momentary action. These are momentary action switches. The drives are momentary action switches. But you'll notice most of these switches are alternate action switches. Continuous, auto start, fuel switches, these bleed switches. Most are alternate action, but there are a handful that are the discharge switch. There's a momentary action switch. This is alternate action. Isolation valve should be open, and this is what it would look like if it's closed. You'd have a valve light and the flow bar would go away. The mechanical shutter covers that. But we want the flow bar to be on and the switch to be on and the valve light to extinguish, meaning that was an in-transit light. For the bleed system, we'll check that the system fault lights are all extinguished. The APU bleed should be on. The off light should be extinguished. The engine bleed switches should all be on, and the off lights would be illuminated. The off light is looking at the engine bleed valve, and the engine bleed valve right now is closed because the engines are shut down. There's no pneumatic pressure. This is electrically controlled, pneumatically operated, so even though we're calling for the engine bleed and the PRV and the HP valve to, they're armed at this time, but it would take pneumatic pressure and system logic to actually open some of those valves. So we're just checking these switches should be on, the off light should be illuminated. Lighting, we want the beacon right now off. We want the nav lights on. Normally they should be on. Strobe lights off, wing off, logo, you know, depends. If you want the logo light on, if it's night, you could turn that on. And then indicator light test. We did the test in the lighting section. Again, you put it to test, hold it, and then you can go through your whole flight deck and check that all the lights are illuminated. After about 8 to 10 seconds, it goes to a more dim position. You might not see that here because we're in daylight. It seems to do it better when you're in dusk or night, and then you will see it dim in the PMDG model. But it seems like in daylight you don't really see it dim at all. You don't see the lights dim. But if you reduce the lighting, you will see it work. So it does work in the model, it just doesn't work very well in daylight. Now we're done with the overhead panel, so let's go from here, we go downstairs. This is still all the FO. FO starts with the mode control panel. He starts over here with flight director. He's going to turn his flight director switch on. We'll come over to the display select panel. This will be as desired. Probably want to put engine on now because we're going to check that a little later. And it'll come to the EFIS control panel next. We'll shift over here just a little bit. See that? A little bit better. Now let's lower the control column so we can see a little bit better. We'll see that here in a second. So looking at the EFIS control panel, what are we going to check here? Well, we're going to check here that our baro radio is probably in baro. We probably don't want it on radio. We want to make sure that there is no baro here displayed. It's blank. And if anything was displayed there, I could rotate this counterclockwise and go to below -100 and it'll disappear then. There is a section, there is a module on the EFIS control panel, so it describes this in detail. So if you're not sure about anything like how to set the baro or how to set the radio or hectopascals versus inches and what the meters does and things like that, you can go to that module in the training, and it goes into somewhat detail on those things. So we're going to check that that's blank down here. We're going to be in inches because we're in the States. And we'd set our altimeter. Let's say we don't know it now, so we're not going to set it yet. Technique, we could go VOR, and we could go ADF. And that's just to check that both of those work. You know, one is blue, one is green, and just to make sure both switches work. At some point I'll put this back to VOR because I don't need it in ADF for the departure. I'll want it in VOR. We'll be in map mode and range as desired. And right now 10 or 20 is probably fine. And then map switches as desired. I probably want my airport switch on, so that it's good when you fly along. If there's any diversion airports you want to divert to, or possible diversion airports along your route for the selected range, you'd see it on your ND. From here, we're going to go down to the... let's move over a little bit so we can see. From there, we'll check our lighting panel again. Again, this would all be covered in lighting, but we'll assume everything's good here. To check all our lighting on this panel. And then we're going to go down to our oxygen panel. See if we can move in on this a little bit. I'll try to move, let's try to move in on the oxygen panel just so we can see this a little bit better. Yeah, that's good. We're going to check our, foot and shoulder heaters, and our windshield air switches are all off. Most of these are inoperative. Well, the foot and shoulder heat are inoperative on the ground. They only work in the air. And the windshield airways, we could provide supplemental air to the windshield if we need it, but right now we'll check all these are off. The oxygen, we're checking that the doors are closed, the mask is stowed. The normal 100% switch should be in 100%, which is pushed down like it is now. I don't think this switch actually, it looks like I can move it a little bit, but it doesn't look like I could go to normal if I wanted to. It looks like it's automatically just put in the 100% position. I can't really make this switch go up or down, but we do want to check that it's like it is right now, down. And then to do the oxygen check, what we're going to do is it's depends on the airline, but it's usually a 2 or 3 part check. One check is to hold the reset test lever to pull this down, and then you'll see the yellow cross momentarily flicker as oxygen flows. So you can see we did that, and it did show the oxygen. You'll notice in the PMDG model, sorry, I had to clear my throat. You'll notice in the PMDG model, when I pull this down, it does stay down for just a second, and then it goes back up. More importantly, you see the yellow cross indicating momentary oxygen flow. So that's one part of the test. The second part of the test is as you do this with your thumb, usually, pull it down, you're also then going to push the emergency test switch here, and now you'll see the cross continuously, and you would hear the sound of oxygen as well. That's kind of the second part of the test. Now, while you're doing these things, while you're holding that down and pushing that and getting the flow of oxygen continuously, we hold it for about 10 seconds. And then what we're going to do is come over to our status page. Go to status here. And we're going to be looking, while we're doing this test, while we're holding that down, we're checking this. We want to make sure that the crew oxygen pressure stays like you see it. If it drops, it could drop 10 or 20 or 30 psi. Usually it doesn't drop much at all. However, the maximum is 100 psi. That's what you're checking for, no more than 100 psi drop. If you saw it drop all of a sudden to 1,000, and maybe it stays there, then that could be a problem. Could be a leak in the system. Sorry, another scratchy throat. So we would check that the oxygen pressure stays constant and doesn't drop more than 10, 20, or 30 psi. While we're doing that, and we hold it for about 10 seconds and make sure that that pressure doesn't drop. At the completion of that test, now this is not a Boeing test, but some airlines do this. You can check the oxygen mask microphone as well. Let me move in on this a little bit more. Let's move up on here. So what we could do is right at the completion of that test is we could come over and go to flight and go to speaker. And while we're holding the reset test lever and we're pushing the emergency oxygen button, and we see the cross continuously, and we check it for 10 seconds, and then we check the status page and the oxygen doesn't drop. And now we come down here, we could go flight, speaker, and go to interphone. And what that'll do is you'll hear the sound of oxygen across the speaker because the oxygen mask microphone is operating. And that's what you're checking for, is that the oxygen mask mic works. So it's a mic test. Boeing has that as a supplemental normal procedure. They don't have it as normal procedure. Some airlines make that a normal procedure. It just depends on the airline. If you're being trained straight by Boeing procedures, you wouldn't do this. Other than maintenance would check it, but you wouldn't check it. But some airlines have it as their normal procedure. So let's go back over. Let's go back over here where we were. So we check the oxygen. Well, from the oxygen, we're going to kind of come up here to the instrument source select switches. They should all be 12 o'clock, which would be flight director right, nav FMC right, EIU auto, IRS right, and right air data. All right sources basically, including the EIU. The EIU is on the right EIU when it's an auto. And then we're going to check our clock and make sure that works. That it's set to the proper UTC time. I'll just zoom in on this real quick on how to set the clock. We won't go into all the specifics of it, but let's just look at the basic functions of setting the clock. Zooming in here so we can see a little bit better. And notice down here is the control for setting the clock, and right now it's in run. There's 4 positions: run, hold. It used to be called fast slew and slow slew. Now they've renamed these minutes and hours, which actually makes more sense, because you always used to have to figure out what does fast slew mean and what does slow slew mean. So they relabeled these hours and minutes. If we take it and click it 1 click down, that would stop the clock. If we go 1 click down from there, it starts the minutes. You can see the minutes are running now. If you go another click down, it starts the hours. And this starts pretty fast, but in the airplane, in simulator, the real simulator, it actually takes about a second before it starts. It doesn't start right away. If you want to go back to minutes, right there. If you want to stop the clock, right there. And if you go back to run, that starts the clock. Well, that's how you set the clock. I won't set it back to where it was. We'll probably get a time disagree now, but we'll just leave it like that for time purposes. The chronograph can be operated with this button. Let's move back here. More realistically, it would be operated by this button, the clock button. You can operate it by either. I could come up here and push it. That would start the chronograph. And you'll notice the sweep second hand starts. 1 push starts it, 1 push stops it, 1 push resets it. You could do that down here as well. Push, that starts it, that stops it, that resets it. So this is actually more convenient because you're not going to reach way down here and push that. It's right here. The elapsed time can be operated with this switch. This is handy for when you take off. As soon as you take the runway and you're clear for takeoff, we want to probably start that time. It'll come up as all zeros, and then it'll count every minute. It'll count and keep track of your flight time. So this is handy for your flight plan to know when you took off, for your waypoint computation of time. And even if you use the chronograph now, if we were to start the chronograph again, it'll run, but the elapsed time is running in the background, so it's not like you stop the elapsed time, it's running. Of course, as this gets her all the way around, it's going to say 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, so forth. Push stop, push reset, and the elapsed time is still running. Now we'll leave it on, just so we can see it change to 1 minute here. The date, we won't go through the date, how to change this, but you basically change it with this switch and using this switch to change it. From here, notice it did change to 1 here. It's 1 minute now, elapsed time. So we'll go ahead and put that to, we'll clear it, and just bring it all the way to reset down here, and then back to hold, and it stops in the hold position. meaning it's not running. So that's the elapsed time. From here, that's pretty much, that's good enough on the clock. And now we're going to come to our flight instruments. Now you notice the IRUs are not aligned. And if I were to get to this point on my cockpit setup and see that this isn't aligned, I'd stop here. I can't go on from here. I pretty much have to stop and wait till the IRUs are aligned. But that's because nobody's been doing the CDU pre-flight while I'm doing this. So I'm going to come in here and let's bring the CDU down here so we can see it a little better. You'll notice on the electrical power-up, we do talk about this in the FMS CDU pre-flight section. It comes up on the menu page, and then we can select FMC. You notice there is a time date here because we messed with the clock. So we'll just clear that out of there. And let's go to our pause init page, and again check the module on the FMS CDU pre-flight. The other pilot probably would have been doing this. But you'll notice I have boxes here. And it's probably ready to go because we had the IRUs and nav. It's been more than 10 minutes. It's waiting for a position. We're going to use the GPS position. That's the most accurate position. So let's put that in there just so we can continue with the cockpit setup. Now you can see I have alignment. Okay, now I can continue. So I check my PFD. What I'm checking for is blank Toga Toga FD, 8 degrees pitch up, wings level. No V speeds right now because I haven't done any kind of CDU pre-flight, so I have no V speeds. That's a normal indication. That's amber. Ground speed 0, airspeed parked at 30 knots. The MCP defaults to 200 knots and 10,000 feet, so that's normal. -8 on the radar altimeter, that's normal. And the altimeter right now is 2992. And we'll leave it at that. We'll check heading and track are good, and again there's no flags other than this little amber indication, which is normal. Lower CRT, inboard CRT normal, ND, ground speed 0, no flags again. I can just generally look and see that I have my airport, KSEA, Seattle VOR right here. So I can see that I'm in the ballpark as far as position goes. I don't see something like that I'm way away from where I'm supposed to be. The main thing I'm checking for is that there's no flags. Track and heading are the same right now. There's no wind. We're in magnetic, and again, no flags. From here, let's move over a little bit, shift over here a little bit. We're going to check our ICAS brightness. Again, lighting controls, refer to that if there's any questions. EIU and auto, heading and norm, FMC master switch in the left. Alternate flaps off, alternate flap arm switch off. Landing gear down, down indication. Alternate nose and body and wing, guards closed. And glide slope inhibit is blank. Flap override, gear override, terrain override, these guards are closed. And there is no indication of the switch being on. If the switch is on, it would say override. Like you can see there. Close the guard. Should probably be, again, switches off. And then we'll come back to our, we come to our ICAS now. We're going to check our ICAS displays. Let's go back to, let's zoom out here a little bit. Let's select engine up here again. There we go. What we're checking for on the ICAS, we just want to scroll through here and make sure that there's no missing information. So I want to kind of look here and just see there's my total air temperature. I'm in full TO, that's the default. I have good N1 indications, good EGT indications. Look at this stuff, that it's all normal. N2, I got 4 good N2 indications, 4 fuel flows, oil pressure indications. There are 2 on the one side, 1 on the other side, 1 on this side, 1 on that side. oil temperature indications, oil quantity, and vibration. I check the oil quantity as part of my preliminary pre-flight. What I'm looking for is just that there's no missing data, because it could indicate an EIU problem if there's any kind of missing data. So I'm just kind of going down here and looking at these and making sure everything's good. I can also check the status page. I did check it as part of the preliminary pre-flight in terms of hydraulic quantity and oxygen pressures, but again, I can check this again just to make sure everything's okay. I'm also checking that there's no status messages, otherwise I'd have to have these addressed by maintenance. They could affect our dispatch if you see any status messages down here. So that looks all good. Next thing I'm going to check is the messages and make sure that all the messages are normal for this phase of flight. Hydraulic pressure system 4321, that's normal because I don't have hydraulics. Brake source, that's normal because I don't have an active brake source. Landing altitude, yeah, that's normal because I really haven't put anything in here yet, but let's put something in here just so we get rid of that. So let's put Seattle to San Francisco. We'll use that since we use that on the FMS CDU pre-flight. Again, if you haven't viewed the FMS CDU pre-flight, go view that. And then let's just put something in here like Seattle. And we'll put San Francisco VOR. Let's go direct there. Well, let's just put that in there. Just so we have something in the route. Now the landing altitude, it's still there. So something's wrong. So we need to find out what's wrong. I'm checking these because sometimes this could cause it if they were on, but they're not on. So let's see what else would be causing that. The altimeters, the IRUs are aligned, the altimeters are 2992. Let's go back upstairs here. Let's try to see if we can force this. Well, it's escaping me why this is on right now, the landing altitude. Ah, there it goes. Okay, now we've got manual. And let's see if we can force it into auto. So if we go back to push it again, and let's see if yeah, there we go. That's what we should see is auto. We got to kind of force it into it, but we're looking for a landing altitude that's going to be automatically set by the FMC. And since I have my origin and destination in there, it'll key off of that. So the landing altitude message is gone now. Because that wouldn't probably be normal to have that on right now. Some fuel pumps are, off right now, so we have messages. That's normal. Let's cancel. Fuel pumps, TCAS off. That's good. Overrides. Some doors are open. These are all normal messages. Fuel pump, that's normal. So once we're done, we cancel, get rid of them. We want to keep that clear for engine start. One thing I forgot to check over here when I came to my ND is I want to also make sure I see TCAS off displayed. So if you don't see it, if the IRUs are aligned, and you don't see it here, just come up here and push traffic. And that's what I want to see, TCAS off with a 3-mile TCAS ring around there. And that's one of the things I want to check is that it's ready to go, but right now it's off. So we're done with that. We check this again. Recall, they all come back. Check your messages, make sure they're all normal, and then get rid of them. From here, I'd come to my CDU. If, again, let's say the captain did the CDU pre-flight, then what I would do is go to the ident page, and I would start here and do the CDU pre-flight and check what he put in to make sure I agree with what he put in. Of course, if it were my leg to do the CDU pre-flight, then I would have done this after the preliminary pre-flight, and then I would have done my scan flow. And so I just kind of skip over this in that case. Next, I'm going to come down to the radio panel, or the aisle stand, I should say. And let's move down so we can activate some switches here. Okay, so this is the FO's, he checks most of this. The captain only checks this, the audio, his audio panel. Otherwise it's all FO. So I'm going to make sure the radios are on. If the radios were off, this off light would be illuminated. This doesn't seem to work in PMDG. If you try to turn the radios off, they don't turn off. But normally what would happen here is if you push this off, these would go blank, and this off light would be illuminated like you see it now. When you push it on, the off light would extinguish, and the radios would look like they are now. I also want to check that I'm in the proper on-side radio for my radio tuning panel, which is left VHF. If I'm in center VHF, notice the offside tuning indicator light comes on here and here. If I'm in left, that light is not illuminated here and here. If I go to VHF right, same thing, I get a light here and I get a light here. It's telling me that I'm on a radio that's not normally associated with my side. This radio tuning panel is normally associated with left VHF. This is normally associated with right VHF. This is normally associated with center VHF for data link. So if you go to any other radio than VHF right on this side, for example, go to VHF left, you get that offside tuning light here and here. Go back to right, it turns off. So I just check to make sure the radio's on, and frequencies as desired. I can set those later. I'm going to skip this because that's the captain. Make sure this is in data center VHF. I'll come down and check the observer audio panel as desired, and then I'll check my signs. I'm going to want the smoking sign on, and I'm going to want to turn the seatbelt sign on at this time. Flight deck door should be in auto. Come all the way down, check the EVAC is guard closed. Come back up here and check that the weather radar is, again, as desired. We can do a weather radar test. We won't go through that now, but we can do a test if we wanted to, the weather radar. And we just make sure, this is in auto. I'm in left or right. You can see if I push the switch, it pops out, it's left. If you push it in, it stays in, it's right. There's two radar units or receivers in the airplane. And then, of course, these switches would be as desired. Usually we're going to be in weather turbulence. And it'll come down and center CDU as desired. You notice these things do not work in PMDG. If you want to go central maintenance computer or airborne condition monitoring system or SATCOM or ACARS, they don't work. They're here, but you can't access those functions. This is called an MCDU. It's a multi-function control display unit, or multi-purpose, and because it does more than FMC, it does all these things too. Also, in the PMDG, this doesn't work. Interestingly enough, in the iFly, you can actually get into the central maintenance computer and look at some of those pages, which I think is pretty cool, but the PMDG did not feel the need to give you that for access. It's not a normal pilot function to go in there and check maintenance pages, but it's kind of interesting to do so. Rudder trim 0, aileron trim 0, we'll check it again, but we just want to make sure that everything's 0 at this point. Attendant advisory, this is an optional switch. Some airlines have it, most airlines don't. An old airline I used to be associated with did have this switch. And it just simply means that when it's on, there's a light that illuminates outside the cockpit, and it tells the flight attendants it's okay to come to the flight deck, it's non-sterile. If the light is off, it means go away. It's a sterile flight deck now. We don't want to be bothered. Come back up here, check your radio here, make sure that the off light's not illuminated. Radio's on, right VHF. Audio panel is desired. I'll go to left VHF here. Speaker on, as desired if you want to monitor anything. Transponder, we'll leave it on the left. And transponder code we could set to set it to 2000. This is just a reminder I don't have a clearance yet, so we'll put it on 2000. That's technique, you don't have to do that, but this is in standby. And then pretty much from here we're done as far as the first officer goes. He'd adjust his seat, adjust his rudder pedals, and then he's ready to go. El Capitan. El Capitan's going to start up here, and he's got a lot less to do than the FO. The poor FO has so much to do. In the States, he also has to walk around the airplane. You know, a lot of times in Europe, European carriers, the captain walks around the airplane. But in this country, usually in the U.S., it's usually, yeah, you dirty FO, get out there and walk around the airplane. I'm not going out. It's cold out. The captain only walks around if it's a nice day and he wants to. He wants to go for a walk. Then he'll say, you know what, I'll do the walk around today. But normally in Europe, it's more normal that I've seen that the captain walks around. So the FO's got actually a lot to do. He's a busy boy sometimes. However, having said that, it's still the captain's responsibility to make sure that he has set up things properly. So even though the FO does the overhead, don't think that the captain's not going to look up there to make sure that things have been done, because it's his ultimate responsibility. So even though he's not the one to set up that panel, he's probably going to look up there to make sure that it's set up properly. Same things here. I won't repeat too many of them. Barrow, make sure it's going. Nothing's down here. We don't want anything displayed on the PFD for takeoff. Inches, because we're in the States, and right now it's 2992, that's fine. Map mode, range is desired. Again, VOR or ADF, whatever. We'd go VOR, probably ADF on one, but then I'd end up switching it to VOR at some point because I don't want to stay in ADF for takeoff. And then map switches as desired. I'll put on airport again. Flight director, his side on, auto throttle arm, switch arm, bank angle limit selector auto, disengage bar up. If it's down, you'll see it looks like that. That would disconnect all the autopilots. In the airplane simulator, there's a amber, I guess you can kind of see it here, but it's an amber stripe that goes across here. And also, if you run your hand on the bottom, you'll run into this. Whereas if it's engaged, it's flush. So we're checking to make sure it's flush, it's up. And from there, the captain will go to his oxygen, which is way down. Let's go back up here for a second. Let me get a better view. There we go. That's a better view. So he's going to go down to his oxygen, foot and shoulder heaters, windshield air, check all that stuff. I won't go through that again. He's going to check his lights here. He's going to come up through his instrument source select switches, make sure they're all 12 o'clock. He'll make sure his clock is okay, and then he'll come to his flight instruments. Again, if they're not aligned, he's going to stop. But they are aligned, so we'll continue. Blank Toga Toga, FD, 8 degrees pitch up, wings level, no V speed right now because nobody's done the CDU work yet. 200, that's normal right here. That's the default when you have no power. 200 north and 10,000. So that's normal for right now. 30 knots parked, no V speed flag, that's good. No flags, -8 on the radar altimeter, no flags. Heading and track are good. ND, normal here. ND, we're in track, magnetic, that's good, no flags. Airport looks good. Map looks good for what we've got done right now. And GPS is being used for position updating. IRS-3, the triple mix, is being used for the FMC inertial position. And just really check maybe make sure this is good. Brake source, normal to have that on. We've got good brake pressure right now, 3,000 psi. Auto brakes on this airplane are right at here, so the captain would set those to RTO. They could be on the aisle stand in the back as well, and then the FO would put them to RTO. But in this case, because they're here, the captain will put it to RTO. ISFD, brightness is desired, altimeter set, inches or hectopascals, we want inches. And again, no flags, good attitude, good heading. Set the altimeter if you know it. And then we're going to come down to our CDU. So again, if I were the pilot that was going to do the CDU pre-flight, I would have done it already. If I'm not the pilot that did the CDU pre-flight, then I'm going to check it at this time. Again, so I'll go to ident and I'll run through the CDU pre-flight. Again, watch that if you haven't seen it. From there, the captain moves down to the thrust quadrant. So he's going to check all this stuff. He's going to make sure the speed brake lever is down. The reverse thrust levers are forward. The forward thrust levers are back to idle. The flaps are up. The alternate trim is neutral. The stab trim switches guards closed. If the guard's open, it would look like, zoom in here a little bit so I can get my switch, so I can operate the switch. There it is. Auto. These will be in auto with the guards closed. Fuel control switch is cut off. And parking brake, we're going to go ahead and set that now. You can see that on your memo message up here, parking brake set. Also auto brake RTO. The signs are on, the EPU is running, the doors are in manual right now. These are normal operating conditions. So from there, the captain is going to move down to do his one and only thing, and that's to check his audio panel, audio control panel. And again, he might go to left VHF, he might go to speaker if he wants them on speaker, and as desired here. He's pretty much done at that point. He'll set his, he'll adjust his seat, he'll adjust his rudder pedals, and then he's going to call for the pre-flight checklist. So that's where we're going to end up. That completes the pre-flight scan flow for the captain, and prior to that we did the first officer. And again, if you're a flight simmer, you're checking all those things. Again, we did it in detail in the airplane. We'd want to make sure you do it in detail. You will see pilots that are experienced on the airplane that just go fast and they run down through, and they're not really checking switch position. And so those are the people we usually put switches out of position on, to see if they catch it. And many times they don't catch it because they're doing it fast. And we want to make sure we're checking all these things. You can get pretty fast and accurate checking these things if you know what you're looking for, you know what to check. So that completes our presentation of the scan flow, and thanks for watching. Okay, let's lower the HUD and go flying. Until our next briefing, keep the blue side up. Captain Al, out.